Ever since Harry Truman unleashed the dogs of nuclear war in 1945, every American president has been faced with choices about who and what to sacrifice to maintain the power and prosperity born of the atomic age.
You would pass through St. George, Utah.
Few Americans suspected that the price would be paid by their own civilian population.
They knew, and they did it anyway because they were more afraid of the communists than of killing their own people.
Every American president since Harry Truman has overlooked, covered up, and even outright lied about the high human costs of nuclear contamination. Now the world's dictators and our own political thugs need to be called out.
At the zero count, this thing went off with a white flash. It was just beautiful.
The federal government blew up hundreds of nuclear bombs in the state of Nevada after World War II and the Cold War. And that nuclear fallout had to go somewhere. And it went north and east across the state of Nevada into the state of Utah as well. And there are communities all over northern and eastern Nevada that have suffered as a result of downwind effects, in particular, dramatically increased cancer rates. Notably, it disproportionately affected Native communities as well.
The Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, and later the Department of Energy, suppressed mounting evidence that northern Nevada and southern Utah were in the direct path of deadly fallout from 928 nuclear bomb tests.
Underground tests had resulted in radiation going directly into the atmosphere, either from the earth opening up or that there was, from the very second that it went off, there was so little dirt on top of the bomb that the earth didn't happen to open up. This radioactivity had gone into the atmosphere. It was 400 and some of those events. Each one of them was documented in detail. They would follow these radioactive clouds until they got to a city, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, and then they would turn around in their plane and go back to Nevada because it's like that. We don't want to know anything more. That's the kind of thing that these people did. They knew what they were doing.
It's very hard to accept that a government you trusted and believed in would poison you. They poisoned their own people. We were expendable. They honestly thought we were expendable. And I would look at the little booklets. They had a little booklet they passed out to people, saying, you're part of this vast experiment. What you're doing is helping the security of this country. Well, it didn't mention the cancers. It didn't mention getting sick. It basically encouraged us even to go watch the explosions. It's a great family activity. And every little drawing in there, they're cartoons of cowboys and Indians. And I honestly think they just thought, it doesn't matter as long as the wind is blowing east and it doesn't hit these populated states in California, and it's just cowboys, Indians, and Mormons out there, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we were expendable, and that is really hard to realize, that you are considered expendable by your own government. We were essentially their guinea pigs.
Nuclear contamination victims in southern Utah and Nevada formed an activist organization called Downwinders.
Downwinders because there are a lot of groups that have been working to abolish nuclear testing, nuclear weapons. So many of them are so sick, and a lot of the people I started working with have already died. They're gone. And we're still fighting this after all these years. I mean, we fought it under Bush when they wanted to resume testing because of 9/11, and it just never ends. I mean, I'm a writer, so I would write a lot of op-eds, and I'd write a lot about it. But I thought that's not enough. We started doing hearings. We would set up these hearings, and I would start helping to organize people, and we brought them out. We had people telling their stories. There was even one point where I went with other women to DC, and we thought, okay, we're gonna go try to talk to as many congressmen as we can. It was the most frustrating, depressing experience because most of them didn't even know what we were talking about.
Investigative journalist Paul Jacobs was one of the first reporters to focus on this story.
My name is Paul Jacobs. In 1957, Linus Pauling told me that he thought there was an interesting story out in Nevada involving the people who lived in the area around the test site and who were being exposed by the Atomic Energy Commission to fallout from the bomb tests that were being run out there.
It came up a little snowstorm, just a March, spring snowstorm, and when the snow fell onto the ground, it wasn't white, it was the color of this cloud. It was a type of dark gray. So I got off my horse and examined it again, and it burned my fingers. So then I went on over to a reservoir and washed my fingers, and they ceased to burn. But there's no question in my mind that what it was, some of that fallout that remained in the area.
It was the day that heavy wind blew from Vegas, and they had announced that people were not to go outside. But I hadn't heard it on the radio, and after my family left for school, I went outside that morning to put some bulbs in the ground, and I worked there about a half hour, and I started feeling so faint that I could scarcely stand up, and I could hardly make it into the house, and I went in and laid down on the bed. I just felt as if I didn't want to ever get up again.
There's a deep cultural kind of sense that we had to have the bomb, we had to have the superior weapon, we had to test it, but the thing is that a certain amorality had to settle in. There were divisions among the scientists and engineers building toward the bomb. There were people who would leave because they couldn't tolerate the fact that their science was going to be turned into a vast possibility for the end of humankind. So the amorality becomes cultural, and so in the work environment that people find themselves at DOE, everybody is supportive of the fact that you're going to have to break a few eggs. People are going to die, perhaps unintentionally, accidentally, perhaps in enormous numbers, but it's all part of the project. It troubles me historically that everything became sacrificable.
When I got to Las Vegas, where the AEC maintained its big public relations office, they gave me a lot of press releases, and they assured me that everything was all right, and that, yes, there were these tests, but they weren't really going to hurt anybody. Then I went to talk to an official of the Public Health Service, and he indicated to me, without being very specific, that there had been a report which he had helped prepare as a responsible official of the Public Health Service, which had criticized the Atomic Energy Commission and the way in which they had been conducting the tests and the way in which they had been monitoring the tests, and that he personally felt that the health of the people in southern Utah had been threatened by the Atomic Energy Commission. Well, I asked him if he had a copy of the report, and he said he did, but that it was classified. But in any case, he walked out of his office, and I promptly got up and locked the office door and went through his desk and found the report. And to my astonishment and disgust and horror, I discovered that everything I had been told by those people living out in those ranches was verified by the Public Health Service. They were so concerned about the public relations aspect of it that they were doing everything, including suppressing information, lying, evading the truth, in order to cover up the reality of the dangers.
The AEC commissioned a health study of its workers. It awarded the study to University of Pittsburgh scientist Dr. Thomas Mancuso.
Ours was the only study which measured and determined what happened to the workers who left the employment 10, 20 years later and traced them all over the country. There are more radiation-induced cancers than anyone recognized before, and they can be caused by low-level radiation.
Dr. Mancuso's study showed that there were radiation-induced cancers. The Department of Energy defunded the study. a tactic they'd used before.
Both the Atomic Energy Commission and the laboratory wanted me and my colleague Goffman to be silent and to not express our views on the biological effects of radiation publicly. At that time, I had a group of 13 people, and my group was eliminated, and I became a non-person at the laboratory.
I was amazed at the way they handled the Mancuso contract. This was a scientist who was doing the research, and it happened to be showing that there was some adverse effects from low-level radiation on employees. Well, someone didn't like that in the Department of Energy. So they simply take the contract from him and give it to a company that's involved with the nuclear operation. Didn't want to have a study to show that low-level radiation was affecting the health of their employees.
Well, they won't lower the standards because it means that the nuclear power industry will be threatened, may have to go out of existence. It will have to mean that the governmental policy was wrong in the first place. It will mean, therefore, that compensation suits, which will occur anyhow, are more creditable, and it means that the government officials have had wrong advice and have used poor judgment for years. Criminal negligence, as far as I'm concerned, to allow the people to be continuously exposed now, when we do know that there is this real probability that low-level ionizing radiation does cause cancer.
Probably there were people at the AEC who persuaded themselves that this was safe. What if they'd been a little more objective? They'd have worried about it a little more. I don't think that these were evil people. I don't think that these were evil institutions. In hindsight, they were wrong, and in hindsight, they harmed people.
Have you seen any of the AEC minutes from some of those meetings?
Okay, I haven't seen those, and I don't know what the AEC said. In any case, it could be the case that the AEC acted as a rogue agency and exceeded its authority. I doubt that.
Mary Dixon was given copies of the minutes from AEC meetings that were so shocking that she was inspired to write the play Exposed.
I had the Atomic Energy Commission minutes from the years they decided to move testing into the continental U.S. and from the years they had it in Nevada and how they chose that. And these minutes, I was reading them on the plane thinking, this is just high drama. You can't make this up.
Okay. So yeah, I'd like you to read a section of
okay.
Because I think it's important.
Okay. This is based on, well, it actually pulls the minutes of an Atomic Energy Commission meeting. Commissioner Libby, people have got to learn to live with the facts of life, and part of the facts of life are fallout. Commissioner Murray, we must not let anything interfere with this test. Nothing.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered.
Well, I grew up in the era where there was nuclear testing. And in my school, my grade school, we would have these drills where we'd get under our desk. The old duck and cover. They had little Bert the Turtle who sang that song, Duck and Cover.
That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover, just as you do in your school. You may be in your schoolyard playing when the signal comes. Get to the nearest safe place fast.
It terrified us, and they'd send us down to the basement of my grade school, which was dark and scary, with Clorox jugs of water. So we'd have something to drink. And all I remember thinking as a little kid was, but where are we going to pee, and what are we going to eat?
Duck and cover. This family knows what to do, just as your own family should. They know that even a thin cloth helps protect them. Even a newspaper can save you from a bad burn.
And even as a little kid, I thought putting a newspaper over your head under a desk isn't going to save you from anything.
Maybe not surprisingly, the U.S. government was just as willing to sacrifice its own military personnel.
What's it like, Chaplain? First of all, one sees a very, very bright light, followed by a shock wave, and then you hear the sound of the blast, and then it seems as though there's a minor earthquake. And then you look up and you see the fireball as it ascends up into the heavens.
Who have experienced their first atomic explosion, moving out of their trenches toward the blast area with the mushroom cloud still hanging in the air, have acquired an invaluable first-hand knowledge of the effect of nuclear devices and have participated in an historical development of prime importance, the adjustment of the United States Army to the atomic age.
In 1955, atomic veteran Jim O'Connor was assigned to the Nevada test site. He and many others were sent to the blast zone for radiation exposure tests. Some soldiers were placed so close to ground zero, there was no way they could survive.
They brought in a small yellow panel truck, and they left one man with a flashlight at the service road and proceeded down towards the tower, the test area, at the 2,500-yard perimeter, and led them out of the truck.
What he suffered through and saw was horrifying.
I saw what Major Skirker claims was a volunteer officer. And he's bleeding from the nose and the mouth and the eyes. And he had managed to crawl behind a bunker at his wires hanging off of him. The ground was hot enough, it burnt the bottom of my boots. I remember a camera that was pointing at the bunker and not at the tower. I was picked up by two men in protective clothing. They ripped my film badge from me. A civilian cursed as he did so. I was given a shower, which they say decontaminated me. They drew blood. I was gone for a week. But the funniest thing, I didn't see a doctor. The guy I talked to was a psychiatrist, the first one. And the medication, I drank. And the second time, I wouldn't take the medication because I found myself to the point where I didn't know my rear end from my nose.
At the time of this interview, Jim suffered from skin lesions, blindness, and lost the use of his legs, all due to cancer.
Radium, which is a byproduct, if you will, a daughter, radioactive progeny of uranium, actually is very water-soluble and travels in the bloodstream. And as Madame Curie demonstrated 120 years ago, it causes bone cancer. What happens is when an atom of a radioisotope that's an alpha emitter settles in a cell, it begins to bombard the surrounding cells. And that is where you get the development over time of cancers. And I think Dr. John Goffman, an MD and a physicist about 40 years or 45 years ago, predicted that something on the order of a kilo, 2.2 pounds of plutonium, which is an alpha emitter, if it were strategically distributed in water supplies and dust around the world, would be enough to take out the global population.
Just west of St. George, Utah, is a reservation of the Chevwoods Band of Northern Paiute Indians. Starting in the 1950s, they began to suffer devastating effects from radioactive fallout, but were never warned about the danger by the U.S. government.
This one particular day in July, I was out and I noticed a light and a muffled sound of an explosion, and then about 20 minutes or half hour, I happened to look to the west, and there was this big cloud going up into the sky, and I was just sitting there on the ground. The cloud was big, and it was moving to the northeast, almost right over me. And then the next day we went out and to the same place, and there was this it was almost like snow or something like that. And that's the one that got me and caused a lot of cancer in my later years.
We used to do a lot of rabbit hunting when I was a young girl. That was a big thing. And the deers, we still hunt the deers.
And they still use a lot of the traditional medicine and the food back then because, our people were poorer then. A lot of them didn't have jobs, so they survived off the land where it provided. So with the testing and stuff, you know, the animals, the food, you know, are all affected by the atomic testing. And, you know, there's ramifications even today.
The people that lived in Shibwitz, there are a lot of them, a number of families, but then all of a sudden, within maybe 5 or 6 years, maybe they just all started to pass away at all at once.
My mother had a total of 11 of us, but most of the babies were stillborn. Some end up died from some kind of sickness, pneumonia, and they were healthy babies.
Thomas Facey, an MD, PhD from Manhattan, he testified how exposure to radiation can skip generation. A fetus inside a woman when she's pregnant has all of the eggs that baby and later adult woman is going to have at some 2 or 3 months of gestation inside the womb of the woman. And so when you've got radiation firing through that woman's body, or potentially being ingested and going through the bloodstream into that fetus, it can cause a defect in the egg such that the child that is born from that egg has a birth defect. And so the woman in front of you isn't going to have an adverse health event as a result of exposure to the radiation, and her child that you are going to see later is not going to have an adverse, but the child of that child will.
The untimely deaths of John Wayne, Susan Hayward, Agnes Moorehead, and 190 other members of the cast and crew of the movie The Conqueror, which was filmed on the Shibwitz homeland, brought heightened public attention to the deadly downwind effects of nuclear testing. The government was mute.
My father was one of those extras. My mother was one of those extras. I used to have a picture of him when he had his little regalia on, or whatever they had, and he's standing on a horse. And then, like I said, my mom and those other ladies too, they were just part of the extras that were there.
In a lyric to a traditional Shibwitz song, Karma Grayman describes the longing for the untouched beauty of their homeland.
And how after it rains, as you saw yesterday, and the fog was coming up, the mist was coming up, and they say, when will I stand in the foggy mist again? It's called the Shibwitz Woman Song. Yonakaiva to be punad, Yonakaiva to be punad, Anokoni, Pagalawanukuvan.
The deadly fallout from years of nuclear testing at the Nevada test site not only fell on northern Nevada and southern Utah, it drifted east, far beyond those western regions.
They already knew because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that there was long-term adverse health consequences, to put it mildly, as a result of exposure to nuclear fallout. But here they're detonating bombs in the west of the United States, knowing the prevailing winds are going to transport that material clear across the United States. And the areas that are most saturated with nuclear fallout in the United States from Nevada testing is counties in Missouri and New York. What would happen is it would go along and it would hit a cold front, and the rain would come down and would dump the entire amount that would have been transported in these clouds over there. I needed to go about getting top world-class expert witnesses who would challenge the lies, frankly, of the United States government and its environmental impact statements. And I called and talked with someone else who, in fact, wrote a multi-volume treatise about every detonation of a nuclear bomb at the Nevada test site.
I had heard about Richard Miller because of his book, Under the Cloud, The Decades of Nuclear Testing, and I knew he had done this compendium, this U.S. Atlas of Fallout, and I just thought, well, I'm just going to call him. So I kind of called him out of nowhere and kind of told him my story, what I was doing, and he was just the most generous man in sharing his information.
The government essentially admits that nuclear fallout has caused cancer in downwind populations. What the government has not admitted, though, is that a number of states far, far from the Nevada test site also were doused with radiation from the nuclear test program. as far away as Maine, as far away as Boston, New York. This is a map that I produced back in 1982. Each of these dots represents an area where more than 2 fallout clouds had passed over. Some indicate 3 fallout clouds. So if I had limited this area to each fallout cloud, they would have covered the entire United States.
That map says it all. And I carry that map in my purse. Because whenever I start telling people a story, and I say, yeah, I'm a downwinder, and whenever they say, oh, you're from St. George, I say, let me show you this map. People are always stunned. I know in my play, Exposed, and we've done that in many places. We were in Walnut Creek, and when that was projected on the screen, people gasped. They literally gasped. And there was a young girl sitting next to me during this whole thing, and she said, wouldn't that be awful if that really happened? I mean, she didn't know who I was. And I said, oh, it happened. All that happened to me. It's all real. I didn't make any of this up. I'm not clever enough to make it up. This is all real. And people are shocked. And to this day, I pull that map out.
In 1997, USA Today listed the top counties in the United States for nuclear fallout. And number 25 in that list is Knox County, where we're sitting today.
Rich Miller made a visit to the Edina Sentinel to do a little research on the story of a major flood in Knox County soon after the Tumbler Snapper George nuclear test in 1952.
Good morning.
It's Rich Miller.
Rich, my name's Mike Scott.
The nuclear test happened on June 1st, 1952, and the debris came over and down on this place here, this county.
In Edina, the whole county?
Well, yeah, the whole county.
Highly radioactive materials used in nuclear bombs are man-made. They do not occur in nature.
We found out that it was due to one nuclear test, and that test was called George. June 1st, 1952, and it ran into a thunderstorm over this area.
So did they not take any of that stuff into account? Did they not know that it would do that at that time?
But of course, no one ever bothered to call anyone here in Knox County and say, look out, don't go outside, because the rain may be radioactive.
This is the weather story, and this would have been
Thursday, June 5th, 1952. During the downpour Monday, a flash flood reportedly isolated Knox City on both sides during the afternoon. A 1937 Chevrolet owned by Junior Asmus was caught in the high waters when it stalled, and spring water cocked it out as the driver was attempting to go through 6-inch high water over highway number 6. At the same time, there was a debris cloud from shot Tumbler Snapper George. The trajectory of this particular shot, and it goes over the top of the north part of, over Iowa, but a storm front had pushed that down into Missouri, and as a result, you have some of the hottest areas in the entire United States. In fact, Knox County was the hottest county in the entire United States. And the reason for this is because the rain took this material from the cloud into the ground.
That same day, Rich was invited to speak at the Edina Rotary Club luncheon.
One event, that rainstorm between June 2nd and 5th of 1952 made Knox County one of the hottest counties in the entire United States for the entire nuclear test series.
I have a grandfather that had cancer. So the rain, you think the rain is what stopped this here. So if that person would have been out in the rain, then they would have got a really big dose of the radiation. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
We live in farm country, raised our own meat, raised our own vegetables, the garden, livestock, ate that,
our water was from a well.
And it's possible it was from that fallout. We know when it happened.
I could take you from house to house and tell you of the folks who died from brain tumors, kidney cancer, cervical cancer, uterine cancer, throat cancer.
This is a copy of an article that my co-author, Lee Peterson, and I put together and submitted to the Russian Journal of Ecology in 2008. And we found that there was an exceptionally higher than expected rates of different types of cancer, but one of them that stood out was connective and soft tissue sarcoma. The cluster that I'm interested in appeared in 1979. The residents of La Plata tried their darndest to get the CDC interested in it, because if there are hot spots across the country caused by debris, radioactive debris from these nuclear tests, it is worth the CDC's time to evaluate to determine if there are associated clusters, cancer clusters, in these same areas. And as far as I know, it has never been done.
Only a few miles away from Edina, in the little town of Lewiston, Missouri, is the office of Dr. Herbert Childress. Several years ago, he suspected that numerous cases of cancer there were caused by nuclear contamination.
I'm nuclear power trained. I was a nuclear power submarine. So nuclear sensitivity has always been on top of my mind. And I've always been worried about myself for my own exposure. I went to nuclear med school, and it was like, oh my goodness. My practice has, when we were discussing, an escalated amount of cancer for what I consider the region should have. And so,
are you talking about soft tissue sarcoma, for example?
Oh, breast cancer, soft tissue sarcoma, lung cancer. You know, there was just an inordinate amount of it compared to the national level and then the state level. That's what fostered me to get involved in why is this happening, you know? And I have a whole family 20 miles from here, and every one of those family members have had thyroid cancer. Jeez. And they were all young individuals. There's minimal acknowledgement of it. I can't say there's no acknowledgement. There's minimal acknowledgement of it.
In July 1962, a huge nuclear test named Sedan was detonated at the Nevada test site. It sent massive amounts of radioactive material across the country and dumped it on the little farming community of La Plata, Missouri, the hometown of a girl named Chrissy. 17 years later, a cancer cluster was discovered in La Plata High School. Chrissy and two of her classmates had developed the same cancer.
I'm Chrissy Bain from La Plata. This is the place I grew up in. This is the school that I went to over here. We went to school. It's a small school. My class was probably 54 kids. At the age of 15, I was diagnosed with cancer in my arm. I was very athletic. I was a cheerleader. I was getting ready to go out for softball. I was going into sophomore year, and my mom and dad, I kept complaining about my arm hurting, and so they took us to a local doctor here in town who took an x-ray and said that I had a green stick fracture, and said that if it wasn't any better in a couple of weeks to come back. 3 weeks later, we decided to go to our family doctor in Kirksville. He and another doctor did an x-ray and found out, just looking at it, knew that it was cancer, probably way more than they could take care of, and they sent me to Columbia. Because Columbia then sent me to Florida for treatment, because they told me at that time that they would probably have to take my arm. And me being naive like I was, I just thought they were going to give me a new arm that would look just like the one I had. And when I walked into the hospital building, I noticed a little girl who had a wooden leg. And that is the moment of my epiphany that I'm in big trouble here. Two schoolmates that I have, one is still alive, and he lives in Columbia, and we keep close contact with each other. We're really good friends. He had a different type of cancer than what the other classmate and I had. And so he's doing very well. He battles, some heart issues that, I also battle. But the other schoolmate, he passed away 3 days after we graduated. But he is out here in the cemetery, and we place flowers on his grave. This was my happy place as a kid. We had chores, and we spent most of our time outside. My dad had row crop, and sometimes us kids, we'd have to go out and we'd have to pick the big old weeds out of the fields, because that's just, there were 6 of us. I have 4 brothers and a sister, and there were plenty of us to work. We lived off the farm. We didn't have a lot of processed food. So I don't know that there's any really good explanation why there was so much cancer and why 3 kids in one class would have had cancer at the same time. I was really sick for the first, year that I was taking chemo. I had a lot of terrible reactions to the chemo. I was in the hospital a lot. I wouldn't eat. So for me to have to think about that at depth at that age, I probably just didn't. The most devastating thing that I can tell you about my chemo when we got back to Missouri and did chemo at Columbia is that they did not tell me I was going to lose my hair. And my hair was my thing. It was less than a year. I was back in the hospital having a chunk of my lung taken out. I ended up getting cancer again in my lungs and in a portion of my ribs. Cut these ribs out and they moved my shoulder blade over. I went about 30 years. So I think I was on borrowed time. In 2014, I believe, I ended up with breast cancer. 2017, I get breast cancer again. So now if I figure it up, I've got 5 different cancers that I've had in my lifetime. So we're just gonna live on God's time. And so that's what we're doing.
Rich Miller traveled to the town of La Plata to talk to Chrissy about her story.
We had known that fallout had come across the United States, most of the United States, from Nevada, but we didn't know where it went. I discovered that this area here had never been really examined. They had looked at other areas like New York and Boston that had received a lot of fallout, but this place really hadn't. I heard about the cancer cases in La Plata, where there were X number of students, 54 students, I believe, and of that 54, 3 came down with a certain type of cancer, and you were one of them. And so, to me, that's a cluster, and the probability of a cluster happening by chance, based on everything I know and have read, is pretty small. And so when I found that Sedan had crossed this area, and also it had rained during that time, about a year or so, or maybe a little bit longer before you were born. So the area was radiated, and so that started things. The AEC, in a book that was published in 1977, stated that a good rainstorm within an hour can scavenge more than 99% of the debris and send it right down onto the ground. We know what it can do. They knew what it could do.
It's nice to know that there is maybe a reason as to why I got sick, as well as my classmates. So it made me think about it a little bit. It really kind of upset me too that, we have a government that's doing these things and are not responsible for the things that they're doing. If ordinary people do things wrong, and there's consequences to the things that we do wrong. And so I think the government shouldn't be any different than that. The government should be responsible for the things that they do wrong.
It's one thing to write about it. It's another thing entirely to experience it. And my hat is always going to be off to her. I think she's awesome.
Thank you.
You have no idea. You're one of the toughest people I've and I'm in awe of you.
Well, thank you.
Way east of Missouri is the city of Albany, New York. Author Bill Heller wrote 2 books about a deadly nuclear event there in April of 1953.
Now, this one particular test, they named all their tests. This one they named Simon. and it had a higher yield than expected. But what happened was the fallout, which would have gone over the Albany, Schenectady, Troy area called the capital region of New York, it would have just kept going over it, but it happened to intersect with the most violent thunderstorm in the entire history of the area. And it was an incredibly widespread storm.
I think to this day, I've never witnessed a storm like that. I mean, it was like the heavens unloaded. And, it just rained so violently. It was almost like a monsoon.
And it literally washed all the fallout out of the sky and into people's houses, people's gardens, people's fields, people's lives. In 1983, the Atomic Energy Commission had morphed into the Department of Energy. And they had an office in New York City. And they decided that they were going to take readings in Albany. And where did they happen to stop when they got to the Albany area? They went to RPI. Now, RPI in Troy is where Professor Herbert Clark found the readings and told them there was fallout from the Simon bomb test 2,300 miles away. 12 days later, Professor Clark found out that this material clung to surfaces so tenaciously that he had to use hydrochloric acid to get them off a leaf so he could determine the correct, what the correct dose was. They decided to go into Albany and they went to Washington Park. And just by chance, that was where the worst fallout from this massive thunderstorm flooded in the Albany area. Tangular other side of it is Albany High School. You could literally walk from the school into the park, and I'm sure students did that all the time. And I will guarantee you that whatever was deposited 30 years later is still there in Washington Park, right next to Albany High School, where all these kids wound up getting Hodgkin's disease and several of them dying. And these two people from the Department of Energy that took those soil samples and acknowledged there's still radioactive cesium and radioactive strontium in the soil in Washington Park, adjacent to Albany High School, where they found more than 30 cases of Hodgkin's disease, might be worth noting.
Based on a New York Times article, David Gold, a fourth-year medical student at Cornell University, wrote an important research paper on the high rate of Hodgkin's disease from the Albany fallout disaster.
I had been made aware of this article that came out earlier in the 80s that spoke directly about a rainstorm that was suspected of bringing a fair amount of ionized radiation across the country from a nuclear test site out west. They spoke about that radiation storm that fell in the Albany area, but they never took that extra step to suggest that it may have been responsible for anything. So I brought together that article that spoke about this common radiation exposure and what I knew about from my personal experience of this cluster of Hodgkin's disease and other cancers. Well, the abstract of my paper reads, based on recently reported weather data and nuclear bomb test information from the 1950s, an association is postulated between a common radiation exposure in the form of a rainstorm contaminant and the previously reported Albany High School cluster of Hodgkin's disease. In addition to Hodgkin's disease, there are also other radiation-associated cancers in this same population, including leukemias and sarcomas.
Once we had knowledge that the Soviets had gotten the bomb, they got the bomb in the late 40s, there was kind of a hysteria here, that, oh my God, we were supposed to be the only people in the world who would ever have this bomb. And well, it didn't work out that way. And most of us just took it as the norm. And they had set up a testing flat out in the Southwest, in Nevada. We used to see movies of this in the news. They would actually show the atomic blast. And they would, oftentimes the government would set up like mock villages and put cars out there. And you would see the effect of these atomic explosions. And we just took that as being normal. But it was just taken as routine. Okay, they had an atomic test, and they'll do one probably next month, and they'll do one later. The fact that this was going to go up in the air the prevailing winds could cause some damages. And if it did, it was the way it goes. You got to do this to make sure the Russians don't get the better of us. And, you know, there was always this kind of patriotic attitude that we were doing the right thing.
For years after high school, Paul Cullen often returned home to Albany to visit and always took the time to meet up with his best friend, Wendell Fowler.
He was a really athletic guy. And my mother said to me in a very solemn way, she said, something is wrong with Wendell. And I looked at her, I said, well, you know, what do you mean? You know, we were 25 years old. We were immortal. And she said, well, he's at the VA hospital, and he's got a tumor or two. His mother said he's pretty bad. And I was really shocked to hear that because he had looked so good. I said, well, I'll go down and see him. And she said, go right to the room. Don't stop and talk to anybody because they were not allowing any visitors in. Well, that really scared me. So I went in, and he was in bed. He was sitting up. I couldn't believe it. He had lost over 40 pounds. I mean, he looked awful. And I went over to greet him, and he grabbed me by the forearm with both hands, and he just squeezed my arm like, I just had this awful feeling. But I stayed there for quite a while, and we talked, and then I left. And I said, I'll be back, but I had a commitment the next night, and I said, I can't come in tomorrow, but I'll be here the day after tomorrow. And he said, great. So we made it. I said, I'll definitely be here the day after tomorrow. The next night, he passed away. And of all the days, you know, the one day I couldn't be there, this thing must have hit him and just, you know, it just devastated him.
They set up 7 as a barometer of what's dangerous. You have the FDA saying there were readings as high as 120. No, they told us to duck and cover and get under your desk. They should have told you to bend over backwards and kiss your ass goodbye. That's what they should have done.
It's not surprising that nuclear bomb scientists like Oppenheimer, Goffman, and Mancuso became fearful about our nuclear future. The big explosive experimental facility at the old Nevada test site, now called NNSS, regularly tests bombs that thrust dangerous nuclear contaminated dirt high into the atmosphere. We haven't learned very much.
For more than 60 years, the Nevada National Security Site has played a vital role in the security of our nation. What began as a testing ground for development of America's nuclear deterrent in the early 1950s is today a premier location for high-tech scientific experiments, research, reducing the threat of nuclear proliferation, and ensuring the safety, security, and reliability of the nation's remaining nuclear weapons stockpile.
Over the past decade, with public attention focused on the daily political circus, no one seems to be paying much attention to the military weapons industry or the Department of Energy.
And I remember many times when part of the forecast would be that I lived near Louisville, Kentucky, and part of the forecast would be that there will be a fallout cloud from weapons testing out in Nevada. But this was typical. So the Nevada test site figured into a lot of things. People would actually book rooms in Las Vegas, which is about 65 or 70 miles away, in advance of weapons tests so they could see the mushroom cloud. And in fact, before the Divine Strike test, when it was announced publicly by the U.S. Department of Energy, there was a functionary in charge of the National Nuclear Security Agency who, with a certain amount of glee, said that if the Divine Strike blast was achieved, it would be the first time in decades that people would have the opportunity to see a mushroom cloud.
Divine Strike was a huge non-nuclear bomb test planned for detonation on June 2, 2006, at the highly contaminated Nevada test site, or NNSS.
So I first heard about this planned detonation of 600 tons of ammonium nitrate, the same kind of explosive that Timothy McVeigh used in the truck to blow up that federal courthouse in Oklahoma City. Within a matter of less than a week, I had a complaint on file, a motion for a temporary restraining order, and we had a hearing set to get an injunction to stop this bomb test from occurring.
Some of the wise guys decided they were going to develop a bunker buster bomb that would penetrate the ground and blow up and get all the terrorists and so forth that were hiding far below the ground.
Our own scientific team studied a lot of archival records of all the weapons tests and made some pretty good educated guesses as to the probable levels of radioactive contamination of the soil and the vegetation on the site. They made very conservative but frightening estimates of how much radioactive material would be lofted into the atmosphere by a large-scale explosion.
The Department of Defense, Pentagon, advertised to everyone in the surrounding area was that the cloud wasn't going to go up that high into the air and probably wouldn't expose anyone beyond 50 miles or so away. Well, that was hogwash. One of the officials, when asked, said, yeah, probably it'll go up about, the cloud will go up about 10,000 feet. Well, that's in the neighborhood of what an atomic test would certainly do, a real atomic test. And if it goes up that high, then it's going to be carried for a long, long way with the wind. You'll find that some of those particles, if they were thrust up 10,000 feet into the air, and if they were small enough, they would travel all the way to the East Coast.
It's pretty sure they didn't care about the contamination. Let me talk about the A-10 Warthog, which is a battle plane that has been in use since the Vietnam era. It's a very slow-moving jet that actually is used for what the military euphemistically calls ground clearance activity, meaning they basically sweep the horizon with machine gun bullets and rockets. The A-10 Warthog carries modern-day Gatling guns, which are capable of firing up to 6,000 rounds per minute. So when you're talking about using about 80% depleted uranium machine gun bullets, you're talking about an incredibly rapid spray with incredibly destructive capability. Depleted uranium literally causes vaporization.
The rounds are truly massive at 30 millimeters, and sprinkled throughout these rounds are rounds made of aluminium with a depleted uranium core. Uranium is insanely dense.
Depleted uranium is a radioactive waste product of enriching uranium for use in commercial nuclear power reactors. And it's come into vogue in the last 40 years as an enhancement for weapons, particularly machine gun bullets and tank artillery shells. And to harden our B-61 so-called miniature nuclear bombs that are deployed throughout Europe. The problem is that it costs a lot of money to entomb and monitor and all that. And so someone along the line got the bright idea of weaponizing it. And so it adds enormous explosive impact when a machine gun bullet, for instance, crashes into armor. They have incredibly greater penetrating effect with a DU nose, which is what makes contact with the surface of the Earth first. And we're talking about using them as bunker busters to penetrate underground facilities such as at the Bushehr complex on the edge of Tehran. As to whether there are options to use of depleted uranium in munitions and armor and whatnot, there certainly are. Different steel alloys, particularly one where tungsten, which is extremely heavy also, is added both to bullets and armor, is one option, and it doesn't have the radioactive side effects. But what has kept the Pentagon from switching in a more wholesale basis to tungsten is the economics of getting rid of what is actually radioactive waste.
There is currently 700,000 metric tons of depleted uranium stored as uranium hexafluoride in huge storage cylinders across America, costing uranium enrichment facilities a great amount in maintenance. They are simply delighted when someone gets it off their hands and fires it at high speed into a country thousands of miles away. It's a cheap and freely available resource and has the perfect material properties for armor piercing.
At the Piketon installation in southern Ohio, there are, what, 700,000 tons in cylinders. These cylinders are, some of them date back to the 1950s. They're largely sitting outside in the weather, in the elements. A lot of the cylinders are developing leaks, they're failing. There is enormous pressure, politically speaking, administratively speaking, to do something to use up the material to somehow try to neutralize it. So part of it is to try to make a little money back by making DUF-4, depleted uranium fluoride 4, for purposes of using it as a weapons hardener. So the problem is there's a waste problem. The federal government basically changes the name and poisons somebody else outside the borders.
It gets back to that the real driving force for the use of depleted uranium is that there's an advantage in getting rid of that toxic substance, getting rid of that crap outside of the United States and just getting it out of here. And so that's the primary driving factor. And if there's some use that can be made for it, then all the better, because then it doesn't appear to be the United States dumping its radioactive problem on the rest of the world.
Only a minority of the bullets actually hit their target. The rest embeds in buildings, in dirt, in stuff, in trees. You're also not going to have a history of the hotspots. You're not going to have any measurements done, and you will ultimately have very ubiquitously contaminated groundwater wherever it is. Rain will soak things deeper into the water table. Water surfaces somewhere in the form of streams or is pumped to the surface, mingles with dust, and is carried around by storms over centuries.
Secondly, there's no way in hell that you could get approval to disperse that same material in the United States if the federal government proposed that they were going to do that in Ohio or Nevada. And we're going to build this project. And by the way, incidental to that, we're going to disperse a lot of depleted uranium. It'd be stopping any court in a heartbeat because of the damage that's going to be caused. So when we're talking about outside the borders of the United States and American military activity, suddenly none of those rules apply.
In 2019, the continuing threat of nuclear disaster came to the surface in the Marshall Islands when rising global sea levels began to endanger the island's people.
There were 67 nuclear tests performed in these Marshall Islands. The material was scooped up and put under a dome. Unfortunately, with global warming and so forth, that dome is starting to float. And now the United States prefers not to do anything more to maintain this toxic material. The U.S.'s response was, it's not our problem, it's your problem.
I'll tell you, what this shows more than anything is that the nuclear threat is still very much with us. Here we are, all these years later. The Marshall Islands are still a dead zone, basically. They say these things don't leak. This is so much like we heard for years, just trust us, trust us. It's okay. They constantly minimize the danger. But that stuff is leaking into the ocean. And the threat's very much there. I mean, when they think they can dispose of nuclear waste safely, that stuff, plutonium that's in this one, has a half-life of like 1,000 years. That stuff's not going to be safe long after that cement cracks and crumbles. It's never going to be safe.
During the Cold War and where all the testing throughout the United States was, California and Utah and Nevada, all that took place at the expense of the American people, me being one of those. So I'm disappointed in my government that happened.
They've done everything to us that they can think of. Even today, they do. They don't care about the Indian. As children, we played it from sunup to sundown, out here running around in the hills, and then we'd come home for lunch and we'd take off again and go to the river and swim. But that's when the river was good. Now it has so many contaminants that we don't swim there anymore.
The nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain threatens the aquifers throughout the region.
We have the specter of Yucca Mountain looming over our heads at all times, not only to the groundwater here in the Amargosa River watershed, but to future generations. With nuclear waste, you need to look not just a few hundred years in the future, but tens, hundreds of thousands of years in the future, maybe millions. We don't know. We don't know how long this waste will last. If future people, civilizations, uncover our waste, it will be a legacy that we have left for them, a toxic legacy.
We know that the Shivwits tribe and our tribe are right next to the test site, so we probably got maybe greater exposure than a lot of people. And so those problems are real. So really you're talking about water contamination. Mm-hmm. And that's going to last for thousands of years. You know, you're poisoning literally the well that thousands and millions of people may be needing. No, they're just not thinking. They're just doing what they can to get what they need at that time. And most of that has to do with the flow of funding out of the federal government so they can keep their jobs.
All of this nuclear infrastructure is amazingly profitable.
As they say, what's the answer to 99 out of 100 questions in a row? Money. And that's what we're really talking about here.
I think one of my biggest hopes in what I do on this issue is that we will never see nuclear weapons tested again. And I guess my hope for this entire planet is that we are wise enough to stop the madness of nuclear weapons.
Put your vote where your brain is, where your heart is. This government's been bought, and so it's going to continue that way until people force a change.
So I would say support your local environmental nonprofits and be a squeaky wheel for your elected officials.
You know, it wasn't Mother Earth's fault. You know, the government should have known better. I don't know. I guess when there's money involved, that's a different story.
So they're not thinking about the future. They're not thinking about the Earth. They're only thinking, very short term. And it's sad that humans, mankind, has to be so short-sighted and so greedy.
And let the people know what the hell is actually going on. And if we can't handle it, then it's our fault. But tell us the truth, and then we'll deal with it.
The insidious nature of radiation toxicity will consume mankind unless something is done about it now.